going to be the point. So 3 lectures. First lecture was the goals of science, and I said that the goals of science, or the goal of science, is to establish theories that help explain and predict the natural world. Explain and predict the natural world. They aren't the full truth. It doesn't seem that we even have access to the full truth. We can't get our minds around it. But it's very important that we get some kind of grip. And in the realm of the natural world, the rules of our interaction with the universe that are beyond our control, in that realm, science is our way of getting a grip. The next lecture was how do we do it? What's the basic idea about how? And there are some hallmarks of that, but those are not what's really important. My claim was that those are entailed by a certain view. And the view is that if there is such a thing as the scientific method, its real essence is reverence for the truth. Reverence for the truth. That means when I speak the truth, sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, but when I'm doing it, why is what I say true? That's the critical question. Is it because of who I am? Is it because I have a blue shirt on? Because I'm a man? Is it because I'm old? Or is it because what I say reflects a reality that is outside of me that I have no control over? Is it because I'm a faithful and straight conduit? We often talk about honest people as being straight, because they're thought to reflect something outside of themselves, faithful. All right, so the scientific revolution was first and foremost a shift in values. Now, here's the next issue. Judea Pearl, if you've watched the video, he says that the graduates from Toronto University of the class of 2007, are entering the ranks of the scientific freedom fighters. Scientific freedom fighters. And when he says it's a fight has a couple of interesting characteristics. First, a fight isn't a walk in the park. A fight is something you can lose. And second of all, a fight is not a chess game either. A fight is dangerous. So there is something at stake that's dangerous involved in the values that gave rise to the science, to the Enlightenment. And I guess the real question is, are they the natural, normal way of things, or could they be undone? Could that be undone? And if it could be undone, is it under assault? And the entry point for Pearl in that question is just an observation, just a fact, not particularly an analysis or theory. And the fact is this. Abdurrahman Walid, the former president of Indonesia, and Israel Lau, former chief rabbi of Israel, together made an interesting observation published in Wall Street Journal. The countries in which Holocaust denial is most rampant also tend to be the ones that are economically backward and politically repressive. So that by itself is a fact that certain things seem to go together in the world. It's akin to the observation that, I look around at all the different animals I can see, and I noticed that the ones that have hair, also the females have nipples. And you just might notice that. It's just, oh look, hair and they'll go together. Birds don't have either one. Reptiles don't have either one. Fish don't have either one. Just certain animals have these two characteristics. And you might just say, well, that's an interesting fact, but you might say, maybe that's an indication of something deeper. Maybe those animals have something deeply, and all those that are in that category have something deeply in common, and maybe we would benefit from giving a name to that kind and exploring its properties and coming up with some generalizations we could make about them. They might not all be exactly true. There is a kind of animal that sort of defies some of the generalizations about mammals. It's a platypus. The platypus lays eggs, I think. It has hair and lays eggs. So, as usual, just like all the laws of gravity we examined, our generalizations aren't the exact full truth, but they sure are useful. They sure do give us a grip on things. So our question might be why? Why do these things go together? Holocaust denial and repressive regimes. And by the way, Holocaust denial, why would anyone deny the Holocaust? Who denies the Holocaust? Skinheads, Nazis, neo-Nazis, you'd think the precise people that do that, you'd think they'd be the ones celebrating the Holocaust. Shouting out, yeah, boy. Why are they the ones that cover it up? Because what's their agenda? They want another Holocaust. And how would they take a little step in that direction? Well, if people think it might happen again, they'll be watching very carefully, very vigilantly. So what they want is for people not to not care at all if the subject comes up. They just don't want the subject to come up. They just want people to be busy with other things while they take little steps toward making it happen. And the best way to do that is to say it didn't happen in the first place. That's not a thing. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. It obviously is something that, whether it's something to worry about now or not, it happened. It's clear that it happened. And so that can only really gain traction in a place where there is no reverence for the truth. It can only gain traction in a place where there's no reverence for the truth. Truth and sovereignty. Here's the theory that Pearl begins to hint at of why these things go together. Sovereignty means ultimate authority, not delegated authority. What's ultimately important? Some things are important just because they contribute to other things. But some things might be important in themselves. Those have sovereign importance. So here's the question. Society is important, and individuals are important. But why? There's two ways of looking at that. One theory is called collectivism. It is ultimately societies that it's important. Individuals are important because, and in parentheses we could say only because, they contribute to the well-being of society. And the other theory is called individualism. It is ultimately individuals that are important. Society is important because, and in parentheses only because, it contributes to the well-being of individuals. Collectivism, perhaps most famously advanced by Hegel and Thomas Hobbes. Individualism, advanced by, among others, Thomas Paine. Those are conflicting views in the history of Western thought. And there's a question that I would be asking, which is, what difference does it make even in principle? I mean, they're both important, so let's look. The first thing I'm going to do is flesh out how you think differently if you adopt one or the other of those philosophies. And this is the cover of Hobbes' book, Leviathan. And you can't probably see from your seat, but if you look really closely at that picture, that's the king. And the king is made up of little people. It looks like he's just wearing chainmail armor, but each one of those little chinks is a person. And the king is the embodiment of the state for Hobbes, and the people are organs of the state. They are the organs of the state. They are the pieces that make this thing up and contribute to it as their function and their purpose. Now let me ask you something. How are we disposed toward our organs? Perhaps in a way that most of us are not disposed toward each other. And it's something like this. When I was about 26, I had appendicitis. I was in a lot of pain. So I went to the hospital. Doctor finally diagnosed me, and he said, I think you have appendicitis. You're going into surgery this morning. And as afraid as I am of needles and knives and doctors and everything, I was like, hallelujah. They know what it is. They know how to fix it. It was the best news I've heard in a long time, was that they were going to cut me open, take out part of my body, and I don't know what they did with it. But when I woke up, I was still in some pain, actually. But after I woke up and got some morphine and kind of came to my senses, my first thought was, boy, okay, that's better. This thought didn't cross my mind. Nurse, could you tell me where my appendix went? Could I see it one last time? Can we have a moment of silence for Fred? No. It doesn't matter a bit. It has no inherent value because its job was to make me feel good, and if it makes me feel better in the incinerator, then in the incinerator it goes. I never think about it again. I don't occasionally have a moment of silence when I'm in my appendix. And the appendix didn't do much in the first place, but it could have been my gallbladder. There are useful organs people have removed, and they don't have memorial services for them either. But the men that died at the Alamo, every one of their names is inscribed on a stone in, where is that monument? San Antonio, and because they're heroes. We remember them, unlike our organs. Organs are disposable. Individuals in most people's view here are. And that difference starts to, now it's not just, now it sounds a little more real. Now it sounds a little more real. It's not just this is important because of that or that's important because of this. Like, hold on a second. Do I really want to think of people like an appendix or gallbladder? Individualism is advanced by Thomas Paine, the opposite view. The view most of us hold, so I'm not going to explain the water to the fish so much. But then there's a question, all right, that all sounds like an interesting theory and maybe a little bit of exposition about what the theory means in terms of how you feel about things, but what difference does it really make? There's a book called Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. And here is the consequence of the difference that I just described. If individuals are subordinated to the state in principle, they tend to be subordinated to it in practice. The state becomes the perceived locus. That's almost the throne. The perceived throne of authority and truth. The way people think about truth, whether it's in people or in the rocks, if you're talking about the rocks, they also think about authority. It's either inherently in somebody or some institution, some body, or the emperor or whatever, or it's not. It's only in them insofar as they reflect something else. Just like, and here's a little concrete illustration of the difference. One story I'm going to tell you is fiction and one is true. Here's the fiction. But you can imagine it. Let's imagine President Trump walks into this room. He calls me over. Well, first he says, class is canceled. And he says, Dr. Rushton, I need to talk to you. So I would go talk to him and ask him what he wants. And I would decide if I was on board with his agenda, and maybe I would be, if it was something important. I can't imagine why he would step in this room. But I might say, sorry, I can't help you with that. Class is not canceled. And get out of my classroom before I call the cops. So the president is the top elected official, maybe the most powerful person in the country, maybe in the world. But his powers are spelled out and enumerated, and that's all he can do. And moreover, he's not in that place because of his DNA. He's in that place because a certain procedure happened, and he was the one person that wound up being delegated without authority. It could have been somebody else, very easily. But he only has the power to do what it is written that he has the power to do. And some of it is very grave. I mean, he can launch nuclear missiles, I guess, but he can't cancel the Now, this is a true story. In 1944, the close of the war in Japan, World War II in Japan, U.S. Marines were advancing on the island of Saipan, in the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese emperor gave the following, made a statement and gave an order. He said, so in Shintoism, the religion of Japan at the time, the religion of Imperial Japan, the highest place in the afterlife was reserved for soldiers who had died in battle. And the emperor said, oh, I'm going to change that. He said, if the civilians on Saipan, I want them all to commit suicide. He didn't want them to be captured. The reason he didn't want them to be captured, actually, is that they thought that the Americans were savages, and if they were captured, the emperor in the back of his mind knew they would be treated a lot better than they expected. And if that word got out, it might undermine the will to fight of other Japanese. So he said, don't be captured. I want every civilian on Saipan to commit suicide, and if you do, you'll have the same status in the afterlife as a soldier who died in battle, as a murdered soldier. Now, if Donald Trump ordered you all to commit suicide, any takers to Could be. 1,000 people killed themselves that day because the emperor told them. Went jumped off a cliff. And it's not like there was Article 7, Section 5A in the Constitution that said if the emperor felt kill you, kill yourself, you do. There was no one, he wasn't reflecting something outside of his powers. It was all just him, making it up as he went along, and whatever he said went, and not only within his mind, but in the minds of many other people. And not only did he tell people to do things and they did them, he made a pronouncement. You're going to heaven, and you'll be in the highest rank in heaven. And nobody said, Emperor Hirohito, with all due respect, is that in the holy book? Is that written anywhere? Can you corroborate that? Do any of the priests teach that? Didn't enter their mind. Why? Not the way it works. He was the locus of truth as well. It's because he said it that it's true. He had the power to declare that. He was actually worshipped as this god of the sun. So on the one hand, Trump, I don't know, maybe he would tell you to kill yourself, but you're under no obligation to do it, and he'd be removed from office really quickly. Hirohito actually had that disposition and authority, and a lot of people actually respected it. Trump can't even cancel this class. So, three things now are all tied up together, or seem to be: truth, sovereignty, and power. Power is the ability to make people do what they do not wish to do. Power is the ability to make people do what they do not wish to do. George Orwell said, if somebody's doing something fun, if you tell them to do it and it's fun, how do you know they're doing what you want? How do you know you're in control? You have to make them suffer to show you. That demonstrates to everybody. Power is inflicting pain and humiliation. That's what Orwell. Well, it wasn't Orwell. It was an evil character in Orwell's book, but there's a strong thread of truth to it. So, power, sovereignty or ultimate value, and truth all tend to ride together on the same horse. And either a community feels that they are delegated to people because they reflect something outside themselves, like the way rocks really fall, or the Constitution, or something like that, or they're just taken into people who can exercise capricious authority over what is and what ought to be. I have not given any indication, other than the fact that maybe it wasn't such a cool thing that 1,000 people jumped off a cliff, but there's not really a disposition here yet so far as to which one of those is better. Maybe it's better. I mean, there's a lot of drawbacks to only being able to exercise enumerated powers and follow the law. You get to cases where the law tells you to do something, and they didn't really consider this particular case very carefully, and the law is not really applying too well. In that case, taking on a little capricious authority seems to remedy the problem. Sorry about that. I'll turn it on. So truth, sovereignty, and power may ultimately reside in particular individuals and institutions, or they may be delegated to people and institutions according to their faithful accordance with something outside of themselves. And the question is, when people are imbued with inherent power over other people and what is true, and given their own inherent importance, how do they tend to use that power? Now, the person that has studied that the most that I know of is a guy named Philip Zimbardo. Zimbardo performed what's called the Stanford Prison Experiment in the early 70s. In the Stanford Prison Experiment, here's what happened. They took 50 people, 50 young men, all Stanford students. These weren't people who were sleeping under a bridge who could be presumed to be mentally ill. They were above average intelligence and above average mental health in the first place. They gave them a battery of psychological tests. They picked the top half, the most mentally stable, and they split them into two groups, 12 guards, 12 prisoners. They made a mock prison in the basement of the psychology building and set up this mock prison. The experiment was going to go for 2 weeks. But you probably didn't know something. A friend of mine, Ken Ford, is now the president of the CEO of the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a computer scientist. But he used to be a Navy SEAL, and he was in a lot of fights and a lot of battles. But he said one of his very dangerous duties that he didn't look forward to was being a guard at a mock POW camp for SEER school, where they take people and put them in a mock POW camp and inoculate them and teach them how to react if they were captured by the enemy. And he said that was a very dangerous duty. There was no real enemy within hundreds of miles. It was just U.S. sailors pretending to be prisoners of war. But he said, you know, after 3 days in a mock prison, being slapped around and intimidated and deprived of sleep, these guys think it's a real prison camp. They lose their grip on reality, and if you're alone, and they think you're the enemy. And if you're alone with one of them, and you turn your back, and he's not shackled, he will kill you. They will kill each other in that exercise. People's grip, and so I wasn't sure if I believed that. So I asked a friend of mine who had been through Army SEER school, and I said, hey, Stephen, you know what Ken told me? He said that people after 3 days in a mock POW camp think it's real and act as if it's real, and Stephen just scoffed. It's one day, dude. It's one day. People's grip on reality is not nearly as firm. It's only, most of our grips on reality have only been tested under what we'd call quite ordinary circumstances. And very few people actually keep in mind that this is an exercise in a situation like that. And that's exactly what happened in the Stanford experiment. But there's a difference between the Stanford experiment and even a real prison. In a real prison, somebody's watching. The warden is watching, and he goes home at night and he comes back, and somebody's watching him. And there are cameras, and people are coming in and out. The community is watching. In the basement of that building, nobody is watching. And the mock prison became a real prison in everybody's minds. And then it became a zoo. And then it became a torture chamber. About 1/3 of the guards exhibited sadistic tendencies. They would inflict as much pain and humiliation on the mock prisoners as they could get away with. About 1/3 just did their jobs, and about 1/3 would be a little bit nice. They'd sneak an extra piece of bread or something to the prisoners, try to make their life a little easier, but only as long as they didn't have to take any personal risk to do it. Only as long as they weren't sticking their neck out in any way. What nobody did for quite a while was to stand up and say, hey man, this is nuts. This is evil. Stop. That didn't happen the first day or the second day or the third day. By the 6th day, almost the vast majority of the prisoners had nervous breakdowns. Some of them had been removed and replaced. They had replacement prisoners. A lot of them had been removed and replaced because they had a nervous breakdown. I believe all but 2 of the original prisoners, maybe 3, became mentally ill as a result of these temporary breakdowns. Finally, one person came down and saw this and was struck and just saw it the way you're seeing it now. We're not immersed in it. We have our grip on our usual values. It's easy to lose that, but we've got it now. She saw it how we're seeing it, but she was a graduate student. Zimbardo was her professor. So she was really reluctant to bring it up, like, you're doing something wrong here. But she went home, she slept on it, she couldn't hold her tongue. She went back to talk to him. She said, Dr. Zimbardo, this is after 6 days. The experiment was originally planned for 2 weeks. With all due respect, this is wrong. These are boys that you are, and they're being abused. And Zimbardo woke up. He said, you're right. And it ended right then. One person spoke up, and it awakened. But she might not have, and nobody else did. Many years later, anybody recognize this picture? That is from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq in about 2004. American soldiers, now we're talking about a real POW camp. American soldiers, Iraqi prisoners. and it also became a torture chamber. That guy is being, these are electrical wires. There are electrical wires attached to that guy's hand for shocking. And I'm not going to go into details, but you can read about the abuse. It became a torture chamber too. But this wasn't a 2-week deal, and people were not getting out of there. Zimbardo was an expert witness at the trial of some of the soldiers that committed these crimes. He was a defense witness. He was an expert witness for the defense. He was defending the soldiers, and he said it did this. And he said, these guys are culpable and they need to be punished, but they aren't as bad as you think. You don't need to hang them out to dry and make an example. He said, I've been studying this for 30 years. This is normal. This is how people behave when they have power without oversight. These aren't bad apples. This is a bad barrel. And somebody made this barrel, and it was the general that was supposed to be there, just like nobody was watching the Stanford Prisons experiment, and she was gone. For months at a time, nobody, there was no accountability. It went up, and there was somebody in that dungeon that had nobody watching. And Zimbardo said that's the way it happens every time in every experiment, in every historical situation. Nobody's watching. People degenerate. He has a talk on that where he talks about both things, the psychology of evil, and in that talk he also talks about heroes like the young woman that ended the Stanford prison experiment. He married her. He's his wife even now. And so at the end of the talk he ends on a happy note. He talks about heroes are everyday people who do something when other people are doing nothing under situation. Who do something when other people are doing nothing when they should. And he talks about preparing to be a hero and preparing other people to be heroes. Not like in any glorious, spectacular news-making way, but just like that girl in Stanford City. So here's a case study. So here's the thing. Truth, sovereignty, and power can be delegated to people because of their faithful accordance with something outside of themselves, or they can be taken in and made part of a person, making them an idol. And it affects not just scientific progress, but it affects other things as well. As a case study, let's look at the nation of Japan. It was one I thought was particularly interesting because there are some things about it that a lot of people find unexpected. So the first question is, what does scientific discovery and innovation look like in Japan? Is it a country that contributes a lot to science in the world or little? And I would have thought a lot. I know some Japanese people are very intelligent. However, here's the situation. If we measure it by Nobel Prizes per capita, there are a few very small countries. If a little tiny country has a Nobel Prize winner, they're at the top of the list. The Faroe Islands, St. Lucia, Luxembourg, all are very high on the list. But we have Sweden, the UK, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Germany, the US, Israel, Cyprus, Hungary, New Zealand, France, Canada, Finland, Belgium, Latvia, Slovenia, etc., etc., etc. Here's Japan. Below Japan, mostly third world countries. Japan is somewhere between the industrialized world and the third world in terms of scientific progress as measured by Nobel Prize winners, but in my subjective, just feeling it out for 30 years, what I see coming from different countries, that's fairly accurate. Now, why? Japan is a very advanced country in a lot of ways. It's a very important country in the world strategically, very powerful country. Why do they not invent and discover? Well, you might first think maybe they're just not that bright. Could be. The opposite is true. Here are the countries of the world ranked by average IQ. Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Japan. Japan is tied with China for 4th and 5th place. We're among the most intelligent people in the world as measured by IQ. The next possible reason in some cases might be poverty, but we know Japan's not poor. But if they were, that explains why a lot of poor countries are not on the list. If you spend all day planting potatoes, digging in the ground for grubs to eat, fishing and hunting, and you really are having to struggle 12 hours a day to find enough food, you probably don't have a lot of spare time to contemplate the laws of nature, and you probably don't have the equipment to do some of the experiments you need to do to verify your hypothesis. But that's not Japan. Japan is one of the most wealthy countries in the world. Even per capita, here they are, $41,000 per year per capita GDP for Japan, roughly comparable to France and the UK, both of which are very high, and Italy. In fact, some sources put Japan above France, and some put it below. So they're comparable to France or Germany, somewhere between France and Germany, both of which have a very high number of Nobel Prizes. And also both of which have a lot of discovery innovation, especially Germany. So back to the slide. Very little discovery and innovation by very intelligent people with a lot of resources. I have had two different people, one of whom lived in Japan for a while, tell me this, that Japanese people told me that. Said, you know, one of the reasons that there's not a lot of progress is because in our culture, if you have an idea, a new idea, it is an insult to your boss because they are your boss and they didn't think of it first. Sound familiar? Micronesia, all over again. You can't have an independent idea because it's offensive to the people above you in the hierarchy. A friend of mine was touring Japan. Let's go back. Touring Japan, they weren't having a discussion about collectivism. Yeah. Almost never, if you you mean in my experience here in America? Oh, in Japan? I don't know, I would guess so. There's a little bit of that here in the sense of, but it's not so much if you have a new idea, but if you disagree with your boss, there's a little bit of danger, but nowhere near orders of magnitude below. Tour guide in Japan said, in America, you are individuals first and members of society second. But in Japan, we are members of society first and individuals second. They weren't having a conversation about philosophy or scientific discovery or anything like that. It was just about, that was just the Japanese way. And the tour guide was proud of it. And my friend actually thought it was a good idea. She's like, yeah, that's really cool. I wish we would. It's very plausible. She could have been quoting Thomas Hobbes. That's not a straw man. You know what a straw man is where I take a position and I set up and I pretend that the opposite position is something ridiculous. And I say, see how ridiculous this is? But it's, the important thing about a straw man is that's not something anybody believes. But collectivism is something a lot of people believe. Let's next look at two more things. The Cato Institute Freedom Index. The Cato Institute ranks countries by freedom of speech, economic freedom, and various ways the government does or does not interfere in your life by force. Everything the government does is at the point of a gun. They usually don't have to draw the gun, but neither does a bank robber. I could keep the gun in the holster, walk into a bank, and just kind of say, look, I'd like some money, please. And somebody knows what's going to happen if they don't. And that's everything the government does is a gun. There's a few things that aren't. The Federal Reserve kind of doesn't operate. They make recommendations to banks. The banks usually follow them. But if the banks stop following them, there'd be a law pretty soon to put that at gunpoint too. The government is doing what? Spending. The government is providing something for the poor. Isn't that great? No, you're providing something for the poor. See, give me some money and we'll give it to you. So the Cato Institute ranked countries by how much they violently interfere. And by the way, violence doesn't have to include injury. If I point a gun at you and say, give me your wallet, and you give me your wallet, I put it and I walk away, I didn't injure you, but it was a violent act. The threat of violence, the threat of injury is violence. Yeah.
Would the threat of incarceration also be violence?
Yes, kidnapping, the threat of kidnapping.
So every country that levies taxes is committing a violence.
Yes, taxes are collected through violence against the people of the country.
The government ceded its role as a violent monopolist when someone else, some other entity or group of entities assume it as possible restricts one's freedom. So seemingly, just measuring based on government interference in one's freedoms is not a best indication of the freedom that one can actually experience.
What are the other things that interfere?
Opportunity. So they can restrict your
Sure.
activity.
So the Cato Institute isn't measuring that. They aren't measuring how good your life is, just measuring how much the government violently interferes in it. And here's what they find. Scroll down the table. They rank the countries from first to last. Where's Japan?
32.
It's 32.
32. There's Japan. And for the most part, the countries below Japan in that list are below them in the Nobel Prize winner list, and above them are above. There are a few exceptions. Israel, I believe, is pretty low down, pretty low in the freedom list. But with a few exceptions, as usual, the Freedom Index and the Discovery and Innovation Index are very highly correlated. Just like in the title of Pearl's talk, Science and Freedom. Go together, and there's a reason they go together. And the reason is either the truth and the power are invested in individuals, or they're invested in principles. There are a couple of more things. Actually, I would like pop history quiz. The most murderous regimes in history. When you think of institutionalized state evil, not including the deaths of armed combatants, but against civilians, genocide and mass murder by the state, what regimes are the champions of that? So to put it ironically.
Collectivist regimes.
But I mean in actual countries.
Oh, Stalin, China.
Stalin, Mao, Hitler, North Korea. Any other candidates?
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson,
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein,
Pol Pot.
Pol Pot is on the list. No, there's one no, but the Armenian genocide by Turkey, I believe. Let's look at the historical data from the top down. Let me put this. All right. What is Okay, sorry, I'm going to have to find the table. Dictatorships by death toll. Number one, by far, the communist revolution in China. And it's by a long way because it's two separate incidents in this table. There's up to 70 million people in this one, murdered in this one incident, and then another phase of it. Somewhere between 16 million and 70 million. Next, communist revolution in Russia. Somewhere between 10 and 43 million. Next, the Nazi Holocaust, 17 to 17 million. Does that stand out for some reason? They kept really good records. If you play D&D and you know about demons and devils in that game, it's lawful evil and chaotic evil. Some evil is very organized and meticulous. Some is just wild. Seems like the Stalinists were devils and the Nazis demons and the Nazis were devils. They were very organized. They knew exactly what they wanted. And they even had principles that they were faithful. The principles just happened to be The Stalinists were very unprincipled. The Germans said, we want to kill all the Jews and all of the Slavs and all the homosexuals, and they stuck with that. And we want to conquer the world, but they stuck with that. The Stalinists would go after homosexuals one day, Christians the next day, Jews the next day, reformers, communists was affected the next day. There was doctors. There was a phase where they wiped out doctors. There was a phase where they wiped out engineers. It was just flavor of the day of who they murdered. One nobody mentioned, in fourth place in history, okay, there's China again, the Japanese Holocaust and the invasion of China during World War II. If you want to read about it, there's a book called The Rape of Nanking. They killed somewhere between 3 and 14, murdered somewhere between 3 and 14 million civilians. But if you look at the circumstances and how they did it and the things that they did, subjectively, as far as just your imagination of how could anybody do that to anyone, to me it looks like that was the worst one. The things they did are unthinkable in their occupation of China. And after all, what do you expect? If they treat their own people as pawns or organs, well, how do you think they're going to treat other people when they occupy them and have dominion?
Now, did they burn down occupied cities or villages?
That I do not know. I've never heard of them doing that. And one last thing, anybody ever heard of the Barakumen? Might not be pronounced like that. There's a caste system in Japan. It used to be official. You had the emperor, I believe, daimyo, shogun, samurai, all kind of farmers. But then there were people who, and you probably know about this, in India where they used to have a caste system, and the remnants of it are somewhat still have a legacy. They had the low caste, the untouchables. There was an untouchable caste in Japan. They still live with the legacy of that. It's a little bit, I would say, more official in Japan, a stronger legacy there for those people than for the untouchables in India right now. And they're lower than untouchable. They're unmentionable. A friend of mine heard about this. He was living in Japan. He asked one of his friends, hey, tell me, I just heard about this. I've been here for 2 years. Tell me about the Barakumen. And the Japanese friend said, we don't say that word. We don't talk about it. They're not just untouchable, they're unmentionable. Just because of who they are. Not because they've committed a crime, not because of anything in the process that they've done, but just because of who they are. The next question I want to talk about is this. We've been talking about Micronesia, we've been talking about the Middle Ages, we've been talking about faraway places and long ago times. What about right here? What's going on? Well, here's what's going on. A 2010 survey by the American Association of Colleges and Universities found that out of 24,000 college students, only about 1/3, 36% to the nearest percent, and that's one of your study questions. 36% strongly agreed that it is safe to hold unpopular views on campus. Now let me look at the way that's worded. Safe, not comfortable, safe. To hold, not express, hold. Safe to hold unpopular views on campus. Only about one person and 3 said yes.
Does these unpopular views include extreme views, or just
The people who answered those questions in the surveys could interpret it however they wanted. How many of you, I'm not going to follow up, I'm not going to ask you anything about the circumstance, but how many of you have felt like you had to hold your tongue about something you believed in good faith because you might bring down some anger on yourself if you opened your mouth? Say recently, in the past 2 months on campus. Well, 25%, but quite a few. And some people maybe don't hold any unpopular views, and there's a certain kind of people who will conform to the group, and they're very safe from that. But also, some people might not have raised their hand because they were afraid that I might have said, oh, so what was this unpopular thing you were talking about? And there'd be pressure on them to say. And then I might say, well, why don't you see me after class about that? We need to talk about that. When the question was asked of campus professionals, faculty and staff, only 20% said it was safe to hold unpopular views because they've been around and they know what procedures are and they've seen more people disciplined for opening their mouth. What about right here? I mean, that happens at Berkeley and Stanford. And what about right here? It happened. This was before you got here. In 2004, there's an organization called FIRE that litigates free speech cases against universities. They don't have a lot of resources. They only pick the most egregious universities that are violating people's free speech in the most egregious ways. They litigate just a few cases a year. In 2004, one of them was here. Texas Tech lost. A federal court found that Texas Tech speech code was unconstitutionally vague and broad, and they were restricting student speech in ways that were illegal. What's wrong with keeping your mouth shut? Just this. It's the thin end of the wedge. If it's uncomfortable to say certain things and nobody says them, then they'll always move to the next step. It'll become dangerous to say them. And if nobody says them, but only to the people speaking up, you can just hold your tongue. No big deal. If nobody says them when they're dangerous, then they take the next step and it becomes dangerous to everybody. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a book about the Soviet mass murder, up to 40 million people killed in the Soviet Union. He said, 40 years before that happened, people were sitting around their dinner tables having wine, arguing and speculating what would it be like in Russia in 40 years. He said if they had known what it would be like in Russia in 40 years, they would have lost their lunch and lost their minds. They didn't see it coming because they didn't notice the thin end of the wedge. Solzhenitsyn says, in hindsight, that happened because everyone lied and tolerated lying. Everyone lied and tolerated lying. I'll tell you a story about one of our own former faculty members, Dr. Gelfand. Not Greg, but Michael Gelfand. Everybody has him. Oh, many. He grew up in the Soviet Union. And at one time, Gelfand decided he's going to be a dissident. So a very mild sort. He's not going to throw any bombs at anybody, or try to get a gun, or even throw rocks at a police car, like Sergey Brin did. What he decided he was going to, and he wasn't even going to go protest or march or say anything to anybody unless they asked, but he was a school teacher. He said, if somebody asked me a question, I'm not going to lie. That was his dissent. So somebody asked him a question. There was this guy, a writer, he disappeared. We haven't heard from him in a while. It's chill, kid. What do you think happened to him? And Michael said, probably arrested. Things like that. So, one day the KGB knocks on his... Now, they would have murdered him. He would be dead. But it was the time of perestroika. And the Soviet government was trying not to anger the American government. They wanted better relations. And there was an organization that if a scientist disappeared, they would make an international news story out of it. So he was a little bit protected by that, and that might be the only reason he's alive. But they couldn't put up with this, telling the truth either. They knock on his door, he opens the door, it's them. They said, you have two choices, go east or go west. East is Siberia, west is America. You have 24 hours to be out of the country, we'll be back in 24 hours. He took his wife and his daughter, got on a plane, landed in California, none of them spoke any English. That's how we got here. But there'll be a quiz on Friday. It will be 80% over the study questions, 20% over your general understanding of the principles that are involved in here. Have a good couple of